In today's lecture, Monday, October the 5th, looks like it. Of course, we are covering a discussion on ancient China. I'm mostly going to, of course, be covering the early history of China. I'm going to go into like the culture and geography of early China. So we'll get into that. And then I'll talk about some of the dynasties, mostly talk about the first two major ones that they had, which are the Shang and the Chou dynasties. Then I'll talk about like also philosophy, ancient, like especially mostly Confucianism is the main thing I'll mostly talk about. And Wednesday, later in the week, I'm going to, of course, be covering more into like how the empire, Chinese empire develops. And I'll get up to like around the Han dynasty and talk about that later as well. So anyway, that's pretty much it for announcements and all that. So I'm going to, of course, move on and, of course, talk about ancient China, of course, its background, which you can see China developed about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Pretty old civilization. It's in, like I said, the part of the four river valley civilizations that we're pretty much trying to wrap up this week, because next week I'm going to be moving on to the Greeks, of course, get to next, and then the Romans after that. So yeah, the Chinese is actually the third oldest of the river valley civilization. You got like, Mesopotamia, followed by India, then China, then Egypt. That's usually the order of how old the river valley civilizations are. China's located in East Asia. The eastern part of China is about where it started originally. It's based around, of course, the famous Yellow River Basin, which we've kind of talked about a little bit before about. And China itself, ancient China itself, started in an area in eastern China that's called the North China Plain. I'll kind of show you an area where we're talking about in China. Here's kind of a slide, of course, on some of the topics we'll talk about later. But North China Plain is located around here between where the Yellow River is, also called the Huang He, and the Yangtze River. So it's kind of eastern China, kind of between Shanghai and Beijing. That'll be about the area we're talking about. That's kind of a flat plain area in eastern China. That's kind of west of the East China Sea in the Yellow Sea, which is right here. And that's the area in China where agriculture started, and then also where civilization took off. So a lot of the early cities that were developed in China were mostly in this area, so-called North China Plain. So it's a very fertile valley areas of China where they began farming, a long time ago, China, of course, we'll talk a little bit about the Yellow River. The Yellow River is like one of two major rivers in China. They have like a third one. You see they're called the Z River, I think it's called. But the Yellow and the Yangtze, two most famous rivers. Of course, the Yellow River, second longest river in Asia. It's about 3,400 miles long. That's how long it is. Starts more in central China, flows eastward into the Yellow Sea. And then you got the other river, which is the Yangtze River. It's about 3,900 miles long. It's the longest river in China. It flows also from west to east across China, but empties into the East China Sea. But the Yellow is kind of more famous because the Yellow, like I said, is kind of like where China started, like its culture a long time ago. It's considered like the mother river of China. Like they found like the earliest evidence of humans living in China, in Asia, along that river. I think before I may have talked about Peking man, I think, which was a fossil of like Homo erectus, early human ancestor that was found there. It was found basically in the Yellow River Basin, which dates back something like 1 million years ago, or something like that. So China did start in the Paleolithic age like everybody else, the old Stone Age, with kind of like a hunter-gatherer type culture. And then by the Neolithic period, it began to transgress more towards farming, which probably took off about, it varies, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years ago. It's probably what started. So China, and of course, the type of crops they grew in China, there's different kinds of crops they grow, but the ones that were mostly started over 6,000, 7,000 years ago was predominantly millet, was considered one of the earliest types of crops that was grown in ancient China, which millet is a type of grain that's grown in arid conditions. So a lot of it was grown more in the northern part of China. And of course, rice developed too, which is grown a lot, especially in the southern, southeastern parts of Asia. Japan, Korea grows rice, Vietnam. And so rice will later become like one of the main staple crops you see in Asia. It's pretty much eaten with just about everything in parts of Asia. And so that became, the crop they're more known for. They have other crops too, tea and, other things that they're kind of known for, probably grow soybeans and so on. But, rice became the big crop later. Now, Chinese culture, part of why it developed was due to China being kind of isolated geographically. So kind of like India was like that too. They were kind of divided off by various geographic barriers, such as mountains, deserts, seas, and oceans. You look at this map here, you can see that there's numerous types of mountains that are pretty much everywhere to the west in China. There's, of course, China's got all kinds of mountains all over the place, even around like Beijing. But like some of the ones in the west you see are famous, like the Kilian Mountains are over here, Kunlun Mountains, Tibetan Highland Mountains, Himalayas. All this kind of helps to kind of block people from coming in, say, from the west. Also, a lot of deserts, Taklamakan Desert over here, Gobi Desert over here. Of course, eventually people do break through, like the Mongols were able to get through eventually because of horses and stuff like that. But these are definitely barriers that make it difficult. Like if you're going to walk on foot, it's almost impossible. Like to walk from, say, Russia or Mongolia to China and India. Very difficult to do that. Also to the east, you've got a lot of seas, like you've got the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, of course, Sea of Japan over here, Pacific Ocean way out here. So all that kind of helped to isolate, China from the rest of the world, which it was for a long time, up until maybe the Han Dynasty, when due to the Silk Road, they began to open up to people in the West with various trade routes and so on. Now, also, let's talk about the Yellow River. Of course, I just said about the Yellow River Basin, like I said, the Yellow River is the second longest river in the world, 3,400 miles, Yangtze 3,900. Now, the Yellow River, it gets its name from this yellowish brownish color that's caused from either sediment that's made from like soil or silt that kind of washes down into the river from the mountains. And it's often, the sediment's actually called less. It's spelled L-O-E-S-S, but it's pronounced less. And it does have a yellowish brownish color. I do have a picture, of course, of the Yellow River I can show you. And you can see, yeah, that's the kind of color it has. It's kind of got this yellowish, brownish color, like a muddy looking color. And the soil or silt that it produces can be perfect for farming, so. And so that's why I call it the Huang He, which is, the Chinese name for Yellow River overall. On the right, you can see that China's Yellow River has another nickname that it's also dubbed sometimes, which is they sometimes call it China's Sorrow, or another name I have up there for you, which is famous, is the Scourge of the Sons of Han. That's a kind of another nickname they give it sometimes. They call it that because the river is known for having a lot of major floods. It says thousands of people drowned, more like a couple million have probably drowned from really, really bad floods that they've had in China. And there was like two of the floods I can give you, which were the worst in history. They had one in 1887, the Great Flood. Great Flood of 1887 killed like something like 1 to 2 million people in China. Then there was another one, of course, the 1931 flood, the Yellow River killed, and they're not sure how many it killed exactly, but somewhere between 2 and 4 million people drowned due to flooding along its river basin. That's a lot of people. That was considered, by the way, the worst natural disaster in history. Wow. So pretty impressive with that. So yeah, they've of course created more, control of the river, damming it and so on now. But you can see that the Chinese used the river for different things. They built these terraces along the riverbank, and also dikes were used for irrigation and things like that. And so a lot of people, of course, live along that river today. I think they still have problems of flooding, imagine, today overall. All right, let's also move along. And I need to talk about, of course, China's different dynasties that they're known for. Of course, there's I got to talk about one more thing I just forgot about. Glad I remembered that one. But yeah, I need to talk about also China's different inventions and innovations that they're known for. Yeah, the Chinese are known for a lot of new technologies and ideas that came about over time. I've got a list here I can kind of add on the screen for things that they're kind of known for. The big ones I know are like paper making and printing. So they were the ones that kind of developed printing, especially making out of like things like wood and bamboo originally. Of course, they're the first to use calligraphy and use of ink. So ink kind of develops around that time in ancient China. Other big inventions, compass, which is later something that Marco Polo later brought to Europe, they believe. Crossbow, yeah, people think of medieval times, the crossbow, right? Well, the Chinese invented it first, where it came to Europe, of course, later. Gunpowder, which is used for all kinds of things, making bombs, fireworks. I think they started developing cannons by the time you get down to like the Ming Dynasty, I guess. Silk, of course, which is made from the silkworm, something that they were very secretive about for years. Iron plow, that is true. The Chinese, they think, developed the iron plow. Hey, but you didn't know that. They did, supposedly. Porcelain, there's all kinds of things, of course, that they have invented that's well known. You can see some other inventions I've got listed too. The wheelbarrow, I think it's one there. Yeah, it's a good one there. The wheelbarrow may have been something they may have invented. Different kinds of money and so on. So there's all kinds of things that that they have developed, like different kinds of food, like I think the noodle is something that maybe the Chinese invented. Maybe the donut, that's a possibility. Ice cream, yeah, possibly. So those are all different kind of things that could have been, developed by the Chinese. But yeah, like printing, they came westward and influenced like Europe, and Johann Gutenberg developed one of the first major printing presses in Europe. So all those kind of things may have, influenced later people, in the world over time. So he's kind of just talking about some of the things that the Chinese are kind of known for overall. Now, of course, I'm going to go ahead and move on, like I said, to talk about the other thing that China's known for, which is its dynasties. China is known for having a long line of dynasties that have been around. They think that China's had at least up to about 3,600 years of dynasties. That's a lot. That's more than Egypt. Egypt's like close to 3,000 that they've got, more or less. But there's a lot longer. I think they think that the Chinese dynasty started probably about at least close to the 17th, 18th century, maybe further back than that. And it goes up to 1912. In fact, the last emperor of China stepped down in 1912. That's amazing about that. They have, of course, what they call the dynastic cycle in China. And that's basically a cycle of like dynasties declining and falling, which happens a lot all throughout China. So there's numerous dynasties that have come and go. The first two we'll talk about today, which are the Shang and the Chou, are around a long time, like 1,500 something years or more. They're one of the longest two reigning overall. And the Chinese had this political theory that was real popular that was called the Mandate of Heaven, which was in Chinese, it meant Tian Ming, or heaven's will. And the belief with this kind of political theory was that the reason why monarchs reign was because of God's will. Like if the ruler was a good ruler, he was just, his dynasty and his rule would be a long time. But if they were the opposite, where they were unjust, cruel to their people, God could then remove them from power. So it has been sometimes, compared to like Europe. Europe has got something similar to it called divine right of kings. You may have heard of that, or divine right theory. Of course, their belief is kind of like that, but it's more like, the king rules because of God. I don't know if it cares if they care if he's cruel or not. I don't know about the Europe later, but basically with this theory that the Chinese developed, which the Chou dynasty helped develop, if they were like unjust, or they could get replaced. So it was all based on the approval of God, what God thought of their dynasty and their rule. And if they're not any good, they just get rid of them and they put somebody else in. And so that's why the Chou developed it, because they were trying to say, hey, you're not keeping up the mandate of heaven, God's will, heaven's will, and we're in power because of it. So, like I said, like the first two dynasties, or the Shang and the Chou, which I'll mostly talk about today, they were ruled by kings, of course. Of course, in the video they were started to talk about emperors and all that. Like that guy, Huang He, of course, the emperor, one of the first emperors later. Later dynasties are ruled by emperors because, China becomes an empire, unified big state. And so that's what you have, of course, a little later. So we're going to go ahead and first talk about the Shang dynasty, the first one that comes in, which the Shang, it's kind of a debate about when it starts, but it starts either in the 17th or the 16th centuries and goes down to about the 11th centuries. The Shang dynasty was one of the first major dynasties. They do think there was a dynasty before it that exists, that had some kings, that was called the Xia dynasty, just spelled Xia, Xia. They lived, they were around like, closer to 2000 BC, they think. But they're kind of a legend. They're not sure if they were a real dynasty or not. So there may have been some before the Shang. That's why I say first major. But this dynasty developed in the eastern part of China along the Yellow River Basin. You can see it had different names. It wasn't just called the Shang. The original name that it may have been called was the Yin dynasty. Yin was like one of their major cities and capital, hence the name being used. And later, the later name became Shang, that they called it. And the actual city today is called Anyang, Anyang, Anyang. And so that was the where the ruins of Yin is now, which they've excavated, I think, since I guess in the 1900s, they did most of the excavations on the ruins that are still there. And Yin or Anyang was one of the first of several Chinese capitals that China has had at one point. I think China's had at least 4 or 5 major capitals that they've had, with the current capital, at Beijing, that they got today. The current city where Yin is, like the ruins, the city's got 5 million people living there today. So if you know about China, China's got one of the largest populations in the world. It's almost 1.4 billion population, right ahead of India, which has about 1.3 range. Of course, kind of get into a little bit about the Shang. They don't know too much about the Shang because of mostly from just archaeology that they have. And they do know that it was a type of kingdom that developed in the northern part of China. So yeah, it says 16th, but it may have gone back to the 17th century as far as they know. One thing about the Shang Dynasty, which was very famous, they were one of the first to start writing down records, like written records about China and their culture. And they're the ones you may have heard of that were known for what they call oracle bones. You may have already looked this up already about oracle bones. Oracle bones, these turtle shell, the oracle bones were these turtle shells or bones that were used for writing down language. But they believe that they were used more or less for what I call divination. I'll put some on the screen here for you. Yeah, they think they were used for that purpose right there. For got knocked out is what happened. Excuse me. Let me put that back up for you. But it was used for like divination or prophecy, where they would tell the future. They believe it led to what they call archaic or old Chinese. That's what they usually call the original language of China before it kind of broke off into different Chinese dialects, which the two main today are Mandarin and Cantonese. What happened was they would have these either priests or even the kings would write like calligraphy on the bones or turtle shells. Then they would take them, they would put them over a fire. And I think when they were burning, they would see some kind of prophecy or be able to tell the future, is what basically we're talking about. And the early type of calligraphy that was written on these bones or shells was often called oracle bone script. It's kind of considered the first early version of early Chinese written language at the time. So it's really their most famous thing they're known for, the Shang, is for developing, a language system overall. And then from that, other, cultures came in, used it, and began to develop it more. I think, especially by the time you get to the Han Dynasty, they're really starting to develop the language more, and even develop dictionaries to describe like the different, alphabet they used. So, so that's basically the big thing the Shang, were primarily known for overall. How many have they found? They found thousands of them. Like, I think they found them buried, I believe, in parts of eastern China. I know, like at the site of where the ruins of Yin is at Yin and Yang, they found thousands there at that site. But it says in that slide, of course, that they may have found up to like 150,000 of them all over the place. And it was believed to be part of some kind of religion of the Shang Chinese a long time ago. The kings themselves ruled hereditarily. So basically, the kings under the Shang would pass the. Oh, and by the way, here's a picture of some I've got. If you want to look back later about the Shang oracle bones, I do have pictures, and it shows the early calligraphy on it. But the kings themselves were very powerful, but they weren't exactly absolute overall. And they did practice things like, divination. Like the kings were usually involved in it in various ceremonies that were usually associated with it. It's believed that the Shang had multiple gods that they worshiped. So they were a polytheistic people. They did have a chief god that was called Di, usually spelled D-I. And it was often seen as the supreme deity of importance. But they had all kinds of gods that were associated with the natural world, whether it dealt with like the earth and the moon, rain, and so on. So And you can see there that the Shang introduced different things to China. They were, of course, mostly a Bronze Age culture, so they were one of the first to, cast bronze made from copper and tin. But they also believed to have introduced the war chariot, the wheel, to China around that time. Also, the Shang are known for various types of pottery work that's very valuable today, like very, very expensive. Also made stuff from jade as well. Lots of different kinds of bronze work that the Shang were known for overall. So this culture was quite advanced at the time, rivals up there with other cultures we've talked about before, like in India or Mesopotamia or Egypt overall. But it didn't last. They were eventually a culture, which would get overwhelmed by other people and conquered. And that's what happened eventually with them. They got conquered by other people that came in. And that's, of course, what we next want to talk about. There's some Shang pottery, of course, to look at right there, which they were known for. Of course, they had the Chou or Zhou dynasty, which came in next. That particular dynasty came in and eventually conquered the Shang close to about the 11th century BC. So a little over 3,000 years ago. The Chou were like a type of Chinese people that lived kind of into the central western part of China, like west of the Shang people. They were kind of considered like barbarians originally when they first came in, but they then took over China and adopted a lot of the culture that the Shang had developed. And the Chou would go on to reign a long time. You can see they were in power from like the 11th century at one point down to the 3rd century BC, which is close to almost 800 years that they're in power. Although the later part of it's not as powerful, the Chou. So the Chou is one of the longest reigning dynasties in Chinese history. And they were just like the Shang. They were ruled by, kings as well. So there were no emperors yet at that point. The Chou were known for doing different things in China. One thing they did was they introduced iron. They think around that time iron came into China. People figured out how to make iron weapons and tools at that point. So like the iron plow was believed to have kind of been developed around that time. Iron swords, stuff like that. Also, they believe the Chou were involved in developing the crossbow. So all this, in a sense, led China into the Iron Age about that time. And the Chou later moved the main capital of China from Anyang or Yin to another city called Luoyang. That was one of their main capitals they eventually have, which is also called today the modern city of Xingqiao. Yeah, Xingqiao, when they say it. And or Chou or Chou, either way it's pronounced. And they do think the Chou or Chou was developed by this ruling dynasty family that was called the Ji, J-I. So they founded it close to the 11th century. It's believed that they were the family, the dynasty, that helped to develop the mandate of heaven, which I told you about, that theory, political theory. And part of why they developed it was they were trying to explain to the Chinese people about why the Chou took over China and took it from the Shang, because they said basically the Shang wasn't, looking up. They weren't like, living up to the whole mandate of heaven, God's will of being just rulers. And supposedly the later Shang rulers were kind of cruel to their people. That may have been why they got overthrown. So now, one thing about the Chou dynasty, that period, it is kind of divided up into different periods, which there's two main periods. There's the Western Chou, about the 11th to the 8th centuries BC. And they have what they call the Eastern Chou, 8th to about the 3rd centuries BC. The Western part is more like a period, just kind of like part of the Bronze Age in China. And then under the Eastern Chou, that's when they moved the capital I told you about, that I'm talking about. to Xing Chao or Lao Yang about that time. And Eastern Chao, I'll get to it later, was a period where China went through kind of like a feudal period, which I'll get to next about that. I do have some slides, of course, on the Chou dynasty if you want to look at them. So that's basically the time period. So it may have been like 12. There's a debate about when it starts, I guess, roughly. But you can see that they ruled down to a period that I'll get to later called the period of the Warring States. But the later period, of course, of China during that time was kind of weaker. So kings were powerful, at least in the Western Chao. Then later, over time, the Eastern one's not as powerful that they'll have. And I had a slide, of course, on the mandate of heaven, if you want to look at that too, which we've already talked about. But that's basically, you know, where that came from. Right, yeah, one thing that the Chou dynasty is known for, of course, is that they had like feudalism that developed in China a long time ago. And there's different names they call it. Of course, some people, I just call it the Chinese feudal period, which I think some people would dub it that in English. But there's actually a Chinese name that they have, which is called Fing Zhen, I think how they say it. You see right there. And what happened was after the Western Chou declined, the kings became figureheads, and there was a case where all these powerful Chinese warlords took over China. They broke up China into these various vassal-type states that were all over the place. They were kind of like under the king, but the king was a figurehead, like I said, and had a social structure where you had like these lords at the top, vassals under them, and then on the bottom, you had the peasants, you know, that were non-nobility that were there. And under this period in China, they broke up the land. They had this land distribution system that they developed that was well known. That was called later the well-field system, it was called. And what they did was they would break their land up into like 9 plots. 8 would be private land. They'd have one plot that would be public land. And what it was that the eight private land plots would be worked by the peasants for themselves. In that 9th plot, they would work it for the lord, you know, of the land or whatever, and they would give him part of the give him the whole crop from that public one as a form of tribute to him. So that's kind of like medieval Europe. Medieval Europe did the same thing, like peasants and serfs and stuff like that. They kind of did the same thing where they would have their own land that they would work. Then they'd work the Lord's land and give him that crop to him, you know, as a form of tribute, basically. This Chinese feudal period, it mostly happened around what they call the spring and autumn period. At least that was the peak of the feudal period, which the spring and autumn period was a period that was part of the Eastern Chou period, which was between about the 8th century to BC. You can see like 771 to about 481 BCE was about the time period of it, of when it happened. And then what happened was after that happened, you had this chaotic period that happened under the Eastern Chou, where they had the Warring States period came in. You can see 481 to 221. That's where all the nobility, all these different vassal states broke up China. They started fighting each other in a series of wars that would last close to two and a half centuries as a whole. Of course, we won't get to that today, but I'll talk about later how that later leads into like a unified Chinese empire, because that guy Chen Shi Huangdi is going to eventually emerge to take over China and develop, you know, what they call the Chinese empire. You do notice on the bottom there that one thing that happened during the spring and autumn period that's very famous, they had a period called the Chinese 100 Schools of Thought came in. The 100 Schools of Thought started. And what that was, it was a period where there was a series of philosophical movements or schools that developed throughout China. Starts in the 6th century, about roughly. And what happened was you had all these various scholars and philosophers that started developing their own ideas in China. Some were based on morals and ethical ideas and laws and so on. And eventually it developed into various religious philosophical systems, of course, that are well known in China, like we see in modern times as a whole. And of course, some of these various philosophies we're talking about, I'll talk about. Of course, there's that map to show you for later, but when I get to the warring states, I'll talk more about that later. But those are the three big ones there: Confucianism, Daoism, and legalism. There's of course other ones that developed also besides that, but that's the ones that were the big ones that were, of course, well known overall. Put them up on here as well. These are all different Chinese philosophies. Daoism is also called Taoism, so it's kind of the same thing. Basically, those two right there. There's also one called the School of Yin and Yang, which you may have heard of, which also influenced Daoism as well. It's this idea of a concept of dualism, like in the natural world and universe. And it's the idea that there's opposites of each other, like black and white, cold and hot, good and evil, male and female. So opposite dualistic things. And it's something that's a big part of Daoism later as well. So the School of Yin and Yang, you may have seen the symbol of it. It's this black and white, looks like two fishes that are black and white that are together. I'll show it to you later. But of course, out of the different, Chinese philosophies, the one that was the most famous was Confucianism. Confucianism, of course, is a type of philosophical religious system that developed about 2,500 years ago. And of course, it was founded by Confucius, who they think was a philosopher in China, but also some kind of politician that may have been a powerful, like, minister of some type, which is sometimes called a she. He lived between like the 6th and 5th centuries BC, and Confucius wanted to develop this moral and ethical type system to make China a better place. So I think at the time, China had a lot of problems with corruption and immoral behavior. And so he believed that if there was this kind of system, that it would create a more stable type society as a whole. Now, there's kinds of pictures of him right there. I've got some pictures of him all over the place. I think there's one like a statue of him. There's statues of him probably in China all over the place today, and other places as well. His name, of course, it kind of translates in different ways, but it's usually Master Kong is usually the translation of it. Like I've got the thing right here, Kung Fu Si or Kung Fu Su. I think there's different ways they pronounce it, but usually it means Master Kong or Master Kong, either way. The Catholic Jesuits that went to China, I think they're mostly Portuguese, etc., eventually took the name, the Chinese name, and they kind of slurred it. And eventually, by the 1500s and afterwards, it became known as Confucius. So, hence the name Confucius is more of a Western name than what they say in China. But I guess in China they kind of use it now, just because it's popular. Now, Confucius had different ideas about how he wanted to perfect society. Of course, one of the most famous things he developed, you may have heard of, is the 5 Confucian relationships, which is often called the 5 bonds. And this was an idea of Confucius to create social harmony in society. He thought that was one of the key things to making a better society in general. You didn't want like your sister marrying your brother and all that kind of stuff. You see somewhere else like in Egypt. So they came up with various, rules of proper conduct, how people, would treat each other and so on, or how act with each other in general. These are the 5 basic ones, of course, they have, which are First one, of course, is usually ruler and subject. So the ruler would treat the subject a certain way. And usually, if it's on the other side, the right part of the side there, the subject would be subservient to the ruler, usually. Father to the son. Of course, father would respect the son in a certain way. And of course, the son would be subservient to the father. He's older and wiser than his father. Husband, of course, to wife. Of course, husband will treat the wife a certain way, and the wife will be subservient to the husband. Elder brother to the younger brother. So the elder brother, like the older ones, would have more respect, of course, because they're elder. Friend and friend, of course, is the other one, of course, as well. So everything kind of goes a certain way. And then, of course, another thing that, of course, the Confucius, of course, helped, practice with Confucianism that's still around today. It's also in like other types of similar systems as well. Filial piety. That's something that's real important as well. That, of course, is respect towards elders, respect towards your parents, respect toward the dead, towards your ancestors, like your grandfather and so on. So these are kind of considered key virtues that are part of a lot of Eastern cultures. China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, etc. So you see it's a lot in East Asia. And it's a lot, of course, that shows up in Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and even other religions all over the place as well. Oh, and, and they have also ancestor veneration is also something similar to it as well, where you respect the dead, love the dead, and so on. So that's something that's kind of similar to filial piety, except dealing with your ancestors that are deceased. And that might be like your grandfather, great-grandfather, but it could be hundreds of years ago, other people that existed. Of course, one of the most famous things that, Confucius is well known for, I think there's, of course, another slide there if you want to look at it, of that going more into the 5 basic relationships. But of course, one thing that Confucius is very famous for is his golden rule. It's considered his most famous teaching that's been around forever. And it's the principle of treating others on how you want to be treated. Do not treat others in ways that you would not like to be treated. There's other versions of it too that are kind of similar to it. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. There's all kinds of versions. I think Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount's got one similar to it, I think, which is do not do unto others what you want and not have them do unto you. So that's kind of been around, the golden rule. It's pretty much been a lot of cultures, East and West, and it's still true today, overall. Now, Confucius's philosophy, it would evolve over time. And of course, eventually, after his death, they would write it down. At first, they didn't actually like Confucius. Some of the ideas he brought up, like they were talking about that guy, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, actually tried to ban it at one point. But eventually, it was compiled over so many years. I think over a couple thousand years, they've kind of revised it and all that. And they call it the Analects of Confucius, I think is one name they called it. There was another name I think they mentioned up here that they call it as well, which is the, I think it's called the 5 Chinese Classics or something like that. May have been another name that it's well known. But Confucianism really is a type of philosophical system that has influenced a lot of cultures throughout Asia, not just China, but Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and so on. And they stress a lot on, tradition and family values, honoring ancestors, parents, and of course, education as well. So that's very important. And I know the communist Chinese have tried to stamp it out and all that, but it is still part of their culture today in China. They also have what they call Taoism or Daoism, which I want to talk a few minutes left, and that's probably it. I have a few other things I might talk about as well. And Daoism is like a type of Chinese philosophy that developed around the same time period as Confucianism did. It's a type of Chinese philosophical system that emphasized living in harmony with what they call the Tao or Tao, which is like in Chinese, it means the way, which is like the road or path one has to follow. It has to do with like several ideas. One, of course, Taoists believe heavily in the school of Yin and Yang, which I told you about, which is this school of thought where they believe that the natural world, there's a lot of cosmic dualism going on between, different things that are opposite of each other. And there was a famous philosopher named Lao Tzu, or different names that goes by, but he developed it, and he wrote a philosophical work called The Book of the Way, Tao Te Ching, it's called, and it's kind of where the name of the philosophical movement came from. And his movement became like a rival philosophical system to what is Confucianism. It's not, I don't think it's as popular, but it eventually spread to other countries in parts of East Asia, like Korea, Japan, etc. And Tao is supposed to be this natural order of the universe where you're supposed to stay in harmony with it as a human being, basically. That's supposed to be a key to, I guess they believe in kind of like a heaven or something like that as well. So that's something that they're kind of known for, that started in China. And Lao Tzu, of course, started it a long time ago, which Lao Tzu, you see there, means old master. And he may have been around the same time as Confucius, because Confucius kind of knew about this philosophical movement as well. So the Book of the Way, that was the famous book that Lao Tzu wrote that started it. They do have something else called legalism. I just mentioned briefly about it. I don't have a slide on it right now, but legalism is a type of Chinese philosophy that was later developed by the Qin or Qin dynasty, which I'll get to later on Wednesday. And they emphasize the type of powerful centralized government with an emperor, because in China at the time, the rulers were kind of weak and the government wasn't very centralized. And so legalism will be something that'll heavily influence Chinese government, which his was kind of cruel, I think, when he was in power. If you hear about Qin Shi Huangdi. But over time, Confucianism, Taoism will kind of be influenced by it. And that'll kind of merge together as one over time. I did want to mention about Sun-Tzu real quick. He was around the same time, around the 5th century BC, when Daoism and Confucianism developed. And Sun-Tzu, which means master son, was a Chinese general and military strategist. They believe he was the one that influenced a lot of people on new theories on military warfare in general. And you know about it, you probably may have read it. But he's famous for a book that's called The Art of War. So Art of War has been influential on a lot of people, not just in Asia, but in Europe and the world, on developing new styles of warfare. And of course, they also say how today it's been used even like in business, the business world. They kind of use it as well to learn things. Now, later, I am going to be talking about the period of the Warring States. I'll talk about that on Wednesday, but China goes through a period where China is going to unify, but they have a period where China has these multiple states that fight each other over like about 2.5 centuries, from the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC. Happened at the end of the Eastern Chou period. And over time, what's going to happen at the end of the 3rd century BC is that the kingdom of the Qin or Qin is going to merge to conquer all China. And they're going to form the Chinese Empire. I'll get to that, of course, later on Wednesday. So not today. I'm going to be talking about that. So that's it lecture-wise, of course, talking about China today. I am going to, for a few minutes before I go, I am, of course, going to review a little bit about ancient China, and that's pretty much it. It says, around what major river did ancient China develop its early civilization? China developed around the Yellow River, or called the Huang He, which is in central eastern China. And the Yellow River is considered to be like the mother river of China. So it's where China kind of started as civilization culturally. A lot of their early cities were kind of built close to it, around where the North China Plain is. What geographic features help to isolate China as a culture? There's a lot of mountain ranges to the west that kind of isolate it, such as the Kunlun Mountains, Kilian Mountains. They got the Tibetan Highland Mountains, Himalayas. They got the Taklamakan Desert, Gobi Desert are kind of to the west, north of it as well. Then you got a bunch of seas like the East China Sea, Yellow Sea, Pacific Ocean, all that to the east, of course. That also isolates China as well. What crops were mainly grown in ancient China? Millet originally, it's kind of like an early type of crop that was kind of an arid condition crop that was grown in China. Rice became the big crop later. How the Yellow River gets its name? Of course, Yellow River comes from the color of the sediment or soil that's in the water, which is like a type of soil which comes from, like, I think the mountains, I believe, which is called less, L-O-E-S-S. And it has actually has some kind of material in it, which is, if you want to know, calcium carbonate. I may have mentioned that earlier. Calcium carbonate is something that's actually in it. But it's like a type of mineral and like silt. What was the nickname of Yellow River? Why is it called that? They're talking about the modern name of the Yellow River. It's called often the China's sorrow because of the fact that the river's prone to flooding over the years, especially in modern times, which has killed a lot of people. I think I told you that the river is sometimes called the scourge of the sons of Han. There are some floods like 1887, 1931 that have killed millions in China, so hence its name. What are some inventions, technologies the Chinese were famous for? Told you they were known for silk, gunpowder, crossbow, compass. I think I talked about different types of ceramic. What else did I talk about? Compass, silk, I think gunpowder weapons like bombs, and so on. Just trying to remember some other ones they invented that was big. Printing press, paper, ink, calligraphy. So Chinese were known for all kinds of inventions, which have kind of influenced the world. Iron plow, I think I told you, was another one that they had as well. What is a dynastic cycle? That, of course, is the belief that China went through this period of the rise and fall of different royal dynasties, which happened over 3,600 years or so. What political theory dominates China's dynasties, why they decline and fall? They call it the mandate of heaven, or Tianming. It's this belief that through God's will, or heaven's will, that God decides who rules China. And it all depends on if they were a good, just ruler versus a bad, unjust ruler. And rulers that are bad end up given overthrown because they weren't living up to the will of heaven or the mandate of heaven. What was the first major dynasty of China? The Shang Dynasty, which originally ruled in eastern China, northeastern China. Around what capital did the Yellow River they develop around? It's either originally called Yin, Y-I-N, but they later call it Anyang, which is where the modern city is today in China. What were oracle bones? The first example of in China. Oracle bones were a type of bones or turtle shells that were used to for like writing or language system in China, which led to what they call either archaic or old Chinese. And so it was considered the first written examples of Chinese calligraphy. And what were they and what oracle bones were used for? We already told you that about the fact that they were oracle bones or they were turtle shells, but they were used for telling prophecy, or what they call divination, where kings or priests would use them, put over a fire or something like that, and they would try to tell the future primarily. But from that, they believe oracle bones evolved into what would be actual written language, which would evolve over time. What second dynasty conquered the Shang? The Chou dynasty, either spelled Z-H-O-U or C-H-O-U. What technology innovations were developed by the Chou for warfare? The Chou were the ones that developed iron technology in China. They were the first to develop like iron weapons and iron tools, developed the iron plow. They developed the crossbow as well. They also, I told you, developed the mandate of heaven, which was a political theory I told you that they used to replace the Shang, who they thought was unjust. What was the feudal period of China? That was a period in China during the Eastern Chou period, where China began to decline, and it broke up into these vassal states that were rivals of each other. And it created a social order of lords, vassals, and peasants, just like in medieval Europe that they had. So it's kind of very comparable to that. And I told you that under this feudal period, they had like a land distribution system called the well-field system, where the peasants would work their land, and then they would work land for the lord of the land. What happened after the Chou declined during the Eastern Chou? Well, several things happened. One is they had the spring and autumn period started in China, and that led to the 100 schools of thought. And then the other thing that happened too was the warring states period came in, where China broke up into these competing warring states and all that. During what Chinese historical period did the 100 schools of thought begin? The spring and autumn period is when it started mostly. In China, there was a series of schools that were developed that were based on Chinese philosophy or scholars that lived at that time. And the best examples, most famous types of philosophies that developed in China were, the top three where I told you were Confucianism, Daoism, and Legalism. Those are the big ones. Confucius, of course, is the most famous I've got in the review. Confucius was known as Confucius or Confuci. He was, of course, one of the greatest philosophers of China who lived about 2,500 years ago. Confucius was a philosopher, and they think of some kind of politician of some type. Confucianism is a type of philosophical religious system based on the ideas of morals and ethics. And Confucius taught ideas to try to reform society, make changes to it, more or less. And some of the examples I told you about were the 5 Confucian relationships or 5 bonds to try to perfect society in general between different peoples, family. Filial piety was an idea of Confucius, which of course was the idea of where the younger people would respect the older people, like parents and ancestors in general, like your father, your mother, your grandparents, and so on. Ancestor veneration, some had been around, but Confucius took it and evolved it into Confucianism as well, was where basically they gave respect to the dead. So veneration of the dead, something that you see in Confucianism, but also in other types of religious philosophical systems as well. Then the golden rule I told you was considered, of course, one of Confucius' most famous teachings. That's basically the one about, treat people how you want to be treated. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself, etc. And so we talked about that as well. And then we also talked about Daoism and legalism. I think you might have to know about that later. But those are other ideas we also talked about that were various Chinese philosophical ideas. These two on the bottom, I wouldn't worry about now, but we're going to get to it later. But on Wednesday, I'm going to, of course, have another lecture talking about the period of the warring states that, of course, occurred in China between the different factions. That occurred between like the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC. Now I'll get to the Qin or Qin dynasty. They're going to take over China at the end of the 3rd century. And they're going to develop the Chinese Empire. We'll talk about the first, of course, Chinese emperor, Chen Shi Huangdi, which was of course, that in part of that video that was at the beginning. So anyway, that's pretty much it for China today. Of course, like I said, on Wednesday, I'm going to, of course, continue kind of wrapping up China this week. And so, let me know later on if you have any questions about, of course, this lecture. I am going to, of course, post this video to my YouTube channel so you can see it later. So let me know if you have any questions. And don't forget, about those various assignments I've kind of already talked about or I've sent out to you already at this point. So that's it for today. I'll see you later this week. Of course, like I said, I'm going to wrap up China hopefully on Wednesday overall. So that's it for today. Y'all take care and hope you're safe out there.